Republicans wrap. President Donald Trump officially accepted the party's nomination for president on the final night of the Republican National Convention. We have a recap and analysis of a busy 4 days, including a look at confrontations between protesters and lawmakers outside the White House. Flooding and devastation. Hurricane Laura leaves a path of destruction along Louisiana's Gulf Coast. And seeking help from above. A doctor who treated coronavirus patients is among the pilgrims on a trip to a holy site in France. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, August 28th, 2020.
My fellow Americans, tonight, with a heart full of gratitude and boundless optimism, I profoundly accept this nomination for President of the United States.
President Donald Trump officially accepts the Republican nomination for president on the final night of the party's 4-day national convention. Good evening and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. President Trump promises to protect the unborn, expand school choice, and defend religious liberty. He delivered his acceptance speech on the South Lawn of the White House last night, surrounded by more than 1,000 supporters. White House correspondent Owen Jensen begins our team coverage. Owen?
Tracy, President Trump spoke for more than an hour outlining his vision for America, and he made a declaration concerning born and unborn children. When it comes to the sanctity of life, President Donald Trump did not mince words in his nomination acceptance speech at the White House.
Democrat leaders talk about moral decency, but they have no problem with stopping a baby's beating heart in the 9th month of pregnancy. Tonight, we proudly declare that all children, born and unborn, have a God-given right to life.
And if elected again, the president promises,
I will expand charter schools and provide school choice to every family in America.
His rival, Democrat Joe Biden, has said, quote, we're in a battle for the soul of the nation.
But in this country, we don't look to career politicians for salvation. In America, we don't turn to government to restore our souls. We put our faith in Almighty God.
As protests and violence continue nationwide, HUD Secretary Dr. Ben Carson also spoke.
What is racist is the fact that African Americans have the highest abortion rate. President Trump is the most pro-life president in the country's history.
And on the scourge that is human trafficking.
To protect the most vulnerable among us, I've worked alongside the president as he signed into law 9 pieces of legislation to combat the evil of human trafficking.
The president also remembered Americans who came before, faced struggles, and built a nation in the face of countless challenges.
They love their families, they love their country, and they love their God.
And tonight it's back to the campaign trail. The president's in New Hampshire as the clock winds down to November 3rd. And this weekend he'll visit the Gulf Coast to see the storm damage done by Hurricane Laura. Tracy?
Hey, thank you, Owen. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reporting for us tonight. Philip Crowther, international affiliate reporter for the Associated Press, joins me now from the Lincoln Memorial, where he is covering today's Commitment March. Philip, welcome back. Good to see you. I want to talk about the march, but first, let's go back to last night. President Trump formally accepted the Republican nomination. Talk about his speech and the case that he made for his reelection.
Yeah, well, it took a long time, first of all. It was a long speech, and there's a reason why, is because the president believes he has a very long line of success stories and achievements during his presidency that he wanted to make clear to potential voters during his acceptance speech at the White House. That's why it took him a long time, but also because he really wanted to make clear this choice that Americans have in the November election, a stark choice that he made clear between Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other, between chaos, he believes, if there is to be a potential Joe Biden presidency, and a return to economic prosperity if Donald Trump was to remain in office. It was an aggressive speech at times, certainly towards the former vice president, and certainly also when it comes to, the chaos and the protests that we've seen in many cities, which of course in part led to so many people being here on the National Mall and at the Lincoln Memorial earlier today.
Now, Philip, you've covered both the Democratic and the Republican conventions. What's the key thing that really stands out in your mind between the two?
Well, you know what I would remember is, first of all, what we saw last night. It was an extraordinary thing to see an acceptance speech by a president from the South Lawn of the White House. That is, it doesn't have precedent. And of course, we'll also remember the fact that there were a lot of people there, over 1,000, who were flaunting the administration's very own guidelines when it comes to social distancing and mask wearing. And compare that to what we saw at the Democratic convention last week, where former Vice President Joe Biden accepted his nomination in an entirely empty room, and where all of the speeches, in fact, were held in completely empty rooms because of coronavirus guidelines. I think it's also important to remember that these are two parties and two candidates who see the battle against the coronavirus completely different. Democrats and Joe Biden want there to be want the coronavirus to be fought first for the economy to be able to come back to life thereafter. The Trump presidency and the Trump campaign, they believe that there has to be an opening up of the economy at the same time that there is that battle against the coronavirus pandemic. Those are very different views of how an administration should deal with the current pandemic.
Well, Philip, we just heard that the president will be visiting areas impacted by the hurricane. As far as campaign events, what can we expect from the president and from Joe Biden?
Well, relatively soon we'll be back to something resembling normality when it comes to the campaign trail. We already have seen the president and the vice president out there campaigning at length, though in front of smaller numbers of supporters, largely in airport hangars, where a little bit more of social distancing is possible and where the groups are simply smaller. But the Republican ticket has been campaigning during this whole time, essentially over the last 3 or 4 weeks, and certainly during the Democratic convention. We haven't seen Joe Biden and Kamala Harris on the campaign trail at all, outside of Zoom events, essentially online. But that's going to change after Labor Day. Joe Biden said so in a fundraiser yesterday, that he will be traveling again to campaign in some of the crucial swing states. And he has to, after all, because if the president is out there campaigning, then the other candidate on the Democratic side simply has to do it too. He did promise that he'd do it with all the safety precautions that are possible, meaning that contact with voters, that won't happen on behalf of Joe Biden.
Well, Philip, we have about 30 seconds left, but I have to get to this. Today you are covering the Commitment March, which marks the anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. What's the goal of today's march?
Well, there's a reason why we felt more urgency during this march here. The March on Washington happens every year, but this time around it simply feels more important because of so many cases of police brutality, because of so many cases of so many protests against racism in the United States, and of course also because of what is coming up, because of the presidential election on the 3rd of November, because the speeches we heard here from the likes of Martin Luther King III or from the Reverend Al Sharpton, they all reminded the tens of thousands of people here, and it was a massive crowd, that they have to go out and vote on the 3rd of November.
Now, Philip Crowther, international affiliate reporter for the Associated Press, thank you so much. Well, the head of the Anti-Racism Committee for the U.S. Bishops' Conference is calling for a day of fasting to end racism. Today is the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington, and Bishop Shelton Fabray is urging Catholics to pray and fast for an end to racism. Correspondent Mark Irons reports now from D.C. and today's March for Black Life.
We must rise up together.
Speakers for today's event stand near the same place Martin Luther King Jr. said these famous words.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Today marks the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington that would precede the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Bishop Fabre writes in a statement, "On this Friday's anniversary, in the midst of our country's ongoing racial unrest, we restate our commitment to peacefully seeking racial justice. We stand in solidarity with Archbishop Jerome E. Listecki of Milwaukee, which serves the city of Kenosha, who earlier this week said, 'Violence can never be the means to attain peace and justice.'" Attendees in this crowd tell me they were particularly motivated to come out this year and stand against racial injustice, and Catholics here say their voice is vital. I found the Vatican flag waving among the flags and signs here. It's carried by a Catholic who tells me this isn't about politics, but simply the demands of his faith. He began the day with Mass at St. Joseph's Catholic Church on Capitol Hill and tells me he will pray the litany for an end to racism outside the White House. People of faith adding their voice in the public square. In Washington, Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
With a little over 2 months until the presidential election, the subject of racial equality is just one of the many issues confronting the nation. Tim Carney, senior political columnist for the Washington Examiner and resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, joins me now on Skype to talk more about the upcoming election. Tim, welcome back. Good to see you. Last night, there was a gathering of a different sort outside of the White House where President Trump accepted the Republican nomination. I know you were there last night. Tell us what was going on and what was the mood like?
Well, the mood was varied. There was literal dance parties going on in some place with DJs, people dancing on top of the bus. There were people waving Biden flags, chanting Black Lives Matter, but there were also a lot of people who were just angry. I would call them anarchists, and it really came to a head after midnight. That's when the guests on the South Lawn started leaving the White House compound, and it was all walled in, the many blocks around the White House. But when these people started walking to their cars, to their hotels, that's when they got surrounded by very angry crowds. Now, I didn't personally see any actual violence, but I did see intimidation. I did see yelling. I saw a young man sprint up, clap his hands, and give the middle finger to literally a little old lady with white hair walking with her husband. And so it was definitely an angry scene. And later in the night, there was some violence in the circle around Senator Rand Paul. So it was certainly not pretty after midnight.
Tim, what do you think this says, if anything, about the divisions within our country going into the election?
Well, certainly, I don't think the sort of anarchists and the nearly violent people around the White House represent the average or a very large portion of Joe Biden's base. I do think, though, that Donald Trump evokes stronger emotions than any president in our lifetime, both negative and positive. And you are going to see that, especially Labor Day comes around, these campaigns heat up, and you're going to have all sorts of media coverage. You're going to have all sorts of complaints about the media coverage. And I do think we're going to have a more tense election than any election in my lifetime.
We've had 2 weeks of conventions now and speeches that presented vastly different views of what America will look like depending on who's in office. What's your take on the message from the Republicans this week?
Well, one thing they were trying to convey was that Donald Trump is an okay guy. I talk to voters around the country who say, oh, well, I like this appointment, I like this tax cut, I wish he didn't behave the way he behaved. So by bringing in people who've met him firsthand, whether it be, refugees or family members, and saying he's a really good guy, hoping to soften that image of this brash, brusque fellow. The other thing he said, and he said it very well, and it's very important, he said, my critics are really coming after you, and I'm just in the way, which is to say, he's pointing out that the left is waging a culture war, largely on conservatives, whether it be, the guy who owns his guns and likes to go hunting, or the Christian conservative, and saying that if they take power, there won't be anybody there to protect you. I think those were his two main messages he was trying to convey.
Yeah, Tim, we also heard a lot about safety and security this week. How do you think that message will resonate with voters?
I think especially when you see these videos of these rough crowds outside of the White House, and then you see Kenosha, Wisconsin burning. You see Minneapolis, obviously, at the beginning of the summer, the whole police precinct was burned down. It's something people are increasingly worried about. And Democrats didn't think it would come back on them because, after all, Donald Trump's the incumbent. But clearly, in the last few days, Democrats have seen polls that have said that the violence is really hurting Joe Biden and other Democrats. That's why they're trying to make comments. The question is whether they can actually stop it. I think whatever comments Democrats make won't help as long as the violence and the burning and the looting keeps going on.
Well, Tim, thanks so much for your analysis. We appreciate it. Tim Carney, senior political columnist for the Washington Examiner and resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
At least 6 people are killed in Louisiana after Hurricane Laura slammed the Gulf Coast. The cleanup is beginning, but over 750,000 people are without power. The storm is predicted to move north, bringing heavy rains and local flooding to the Ohio River Valley and the Northeast over the next few days. Coming up, lawmakers continue to debate the best way to stimulate the economy. We're on Capitol Hill. And new developments on the use of face masks in a major European city. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows briefly resumed talks yesterday over a stalled COVID-19 aid package. But even as the month of August winds down, a compromise remains out of reach. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports. Eric?
Well, Tracy, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says Democrats aren't budging. She says it's up to Republicans to bring another $1 trillion to the table in order to make a deal happen. But Republicans I spoke with say that it's not just the hefty price tag that has them concerned, it's the erroneous items that are inside the bill. Stuff they say that has nothing to do with the coronavirus, that they simply can't support.
You have to really run your business extraordinarily well to succeed.
As business owners in Ann Arbor, Michigan struggle to make ends meet,
we're not budging.
On Capitol Hill, another aid bill is nowhere in sight.
They have to move. Why should there be a bill that has far less what the public needs?
The Labor Department reports 1 million Americans filed for first-time unemployment benefits last week. About 27 million Americans are now receiving some form of unemployment aid. Lawmakers say that they want to help hurting Americans.
When Pelosi just digs in her heels and won't negotiate with the White House, there was some crazy stuff in their $3.4 trillion package. You know, they wanted to give $1,200 checks to illegal immigrants.
I asked the Speaker about that criticism. What's your reaction to that?
They're not telling the truth. Let's just be clear. Let's not waste each other's time. They're not telling the truth.
But the HEROES Act has a section called Immigration Matters, and the National Immigration Law Center points out the HEROES Act calls for, quote, stimulus checks for immigrant taxpayers. The House bill also would remove a cap on state and local tax deductions. Republicans say cutting the so-called SALT cap benefits the wealthy.
No family in middle America is saying, thank goodness the Democrats are blocking cash payments to me, money for my kids' schools, and money for vaccines until Manhattan millionaires get a tax cut?
As negotiations continue, 7 U.S. bishops have signed a letter to lawmakers. They are asking lawmakers to consider adding funding for Catholic schools in this latest bill. As of right now, it is not included. Tracy?
Okay, correspondent Eric Rosales reporting from Capitol Hill tonight. Thank you so much. Well, the UK wants to let people get a COVID-19 vaccine even before it's fully licensed. Britain is getting ready to revise its laws to allow the emergency use of any vaccine, but only if it works. Vaccines would get temporary authorization while they're still going through the licensing process. Face masks are now mandatory for everyone walking around Paris. There are new worries that France could become a new hotspot for COVID-19. The mandatory mask order applies to public areas in the French capital, as well as 1/5 of the regions. They are so-called red zones where the virus is spreading. Up next, the longest-serving Prime Minister of Japan announces he's stepping down. Plus, we hear from a healthcare worker from Rome looking for peace while on a pilgrimage to Lourdes. The Prime Minister of Japan announces that he is stepping down for health reasons. Shinzo Abe is the longest-serving prime minister of Japan. He says his decision to leave is, quote, gut-wrenching, with so many of his goals unfinished. He has suffered from ulcerative colitis since he was a teenager and says it was controlled with treatment. The biggest city in Pakistan is underwater after 5 straight days of heavy rain. Monsoon rains are bringing flooding and misery to Karachi. Many are overwhelmed. Some have been forced to abandon their homes or live in unsanitary conditions. There are complaints that the government recovery efforts are too slow. Earlier this week, we reported on the Diocese of Rome's first major pilgrimage since the coronavirus outbreak. Almost 200 pilgrims traveled to Lourdes, France. And tonight, EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief Alan Holdren tells us the personal story of one of those pilgrims, a nurse who cared for COVID patients, and how he sought out healing.
Sono Luigi, vivo a Roma, sono nato a Roma.
This is Luigi. He's a nurse in Rome. But this week, he's been at the shrine of Our Lady of Lourdes in France, where he finds peace.
Io ho promesso alla Madonna tutti i giorni.
Luigi says he promised Our Lady he'd go to Lourdes when things calmed down, and that's what he did.
Io sarei tornato qui.
The 39-year-old has been working with COVID-19 patients in a Roman hospital for the last 6 months. Here in the French Pyrenees, he can breathe through a simple mask. But at work, he's covered from head to toe in protective gear. During the worst of the pandemic, he helped dying patients to set up video calls with their loved ones, their last chance to say goodbye. What kept him going was to see Christ in the people he treated.
Io spero di aver lasciato.
He says he hopes he was a good Samaritan to the dying. Luigi came with the first organized pilgrimage from the Diocese of Rome's pilgrimage office since the pandemic struck Italy almost exactly 6 months ago. The Cardinal Vicar General of the Rome Diocese, where the Pope is bishop, led Luigi and 184 others through 4 days of prayer. And for Luigi, it was a chance not to ask for anything more, but to simply say thank you. In Rome, Alan Holdren, EWTN News Nightly.
Great story by Alan, and we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. We leave you tonight with the close of last night's Republican National Convention and a rendition of Ave Maria. Good night and God bless.